I need to preface this by saying I'm not a tourist. I didn't walk into the woods wearing denim jeans and carrying a single bottle of water. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. I've spent more weekends sleeping in a bivy sack on a granite shelf than I have in my own bed. I know the sounds of the forest. I know what a bear crashing through brush sounds like versus a deer. I know that when the woods go quiet, you stop moving and you listen. That experience is the only reason I'm alive to type this out. But it's also the reason I was arrogant enough to go to Blackwood Ridge in the first place. It was mid-October. The forecast called for a light drizzle, standard for Washington, but otherwise clear visibility. I wanted to check out a section of the forest that had been logged back in the 70s and then abandoned. The maps showed an old service road that petered out into a game trail, eventually leading to a scenic overlook called the Pulpit. It was supposed to be a 20-mile loop, hard, isolated, and quiet. Exactly what I wanted. I parked my truck at the trailhead around 6 a.m. The sun was just starting to bleed through the gray canopy, turning the morning mist a sickly yellow color. I remember the silence hitting me the moment I killed the engine. Usually you hear birds, the wind in the hemlocks, or the distant hum of a highway. Here it was just heavy. The air felt thick, damp, and cold, smelling intensely of pine resin and wet rot. I locked the truck, shouldered my 40-pound pack, and started hiking. The first 3 hours were uneventful but grueling. The service road was barely a suggestion of a path, choked with sword ferns and devil's club. By noon, the light drizzle had turned into a steady, freezing rain that soaked through my outer shell. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in minutes. This wasn't the weather I'd checked before leaving. I stopped to check my GPS, but the screen flickered and died. Batteries were brand new. I swapped them out. Nothing. Just a black screen. I wasn't panicked. I had a physical map and a compass, but a knot of anxiety started to tighten in my stomach. The forest was dense here, the trees ancient and massive, their branches weaving together to block out the sky. It felt like walking through a tunnel. Around 2 p.m., I found the cabin. It wasn't on the map. It wasn't on any satellite imagery I'd studied. It sat in a small clearing that looked unnatural, as if the trees had been violently pushed back. The structure was a ruin, a sagging A-frame made of logs that had turned black with mold. The roof had partially collapsed, and the windows were jagged maws of broken glass. My instincts screamed at me to keep walking. Don't go near it, just keep moving. But the rain was torrential now, turning the ground into a mudslide. I needed shelter for 20 minutes to dry off, eat a protein bar, and reorient my map. I stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under my boots, a sound that echoed too loudly in the clearing. I pushed the front door open. It wasn't latched. The smell hit me first. It wasn't just the smell of an old abandoned house, dust and mildew. It was sharper, metallic, like a handful of copper coins mixed with the musk of a wet dog. I clicked on my headlamp and swept the beam across the room. It was a wreck. Rotting furniture, old beer cans from the 80s, a mattress in the corner that looked like a giant rat's nest. I walked further in, trying to find a dry spot to sit. That's when I saw the table. In the center of the room there was a heavy oak table that looked surprisingly sturdy compared to the rest of the shack. On it, arranged in a neat, perfect circle, were items. I stepped closer, my dread rising in my throat like bile. They weren't random trash. It was a collection. A pair of broken reading glasses, a single hiking boot size small, a rusty pocket knife, a driver's license bleached white by the sun so the face was gone, and in the center of the circle sat a digital voice recorder. I reached out, my hand trembling, and picked up the recorder. It was dry, clean, no dust. I shouldn't have done it, but I pressed play. Static hissed through the tiny speaker. Then a voice cut through. It wasn't a scream. It was a whisper, a man's voice, sounding parched and terrified. "He doesn't want me to leave. He says he looks better when I'm sleeping." The recording clicked off. I froze. The timestamp on the recorder's display didn't say 1990. It didn't say 2005. It said today, 1:45 p.m. I had been hiking since 6 a.m.
1:45 p.m. was 15 minutes ago. I wasn't alone.
I didn't keep the recorder. That might sound stupid now. People always ask why I didn't keep the evidence. But in that moment, holding that little black device felt like holding a live grenade. My brain short-circuited. The logic of who, what, and why didn't matter. The only thing that registered was the primal lizard brain realization that I was in immediate danger. I dropped the device on the table. It clattered loudly, the plastic hitting the oak like a gunshot in the silence of the cabin. I backed away, my eyes locked on the dark doorway leading to the back room of the shack. The shadows back there seemed to ripple, though I knew it was just my adrenaline spiking. I turned and scrambled out the front door, nearly tripping over a rotting plank on the porch. The cold air hit me like a slap, grounding me for a split second. The rain had picked up, drumming relentlessly against the canopy above. I scanned the clearing. The tree line was a wall of gray and green, obscuring everything beyond 20 feet. That's when I looked down at the mud near the porch stairs. When I had walked in, I was focused on the rain, looking up at the roof. I hadn't looked at the ground. Now, staring at the slurry of pine needles and wet earth, my blood ran cold. Next to my own heavy boot prints were others. They weren't boot prints. They looked like feet, bare human feet, but wrong. The toes were splayed too wide, and the arch was elongated, pressing deep into the mud as if the walker was incredibly heavy. And the most disturbing part? They were on top of my boot prints. Someone or something had walked up behind me while I was inside that cabin. They had stood at the bottom of the stairs watching me go in, and then, instead of following me inside, they had turned and vanished back into the brush. I didn't wait. I didn't shout, "Hello?" I adjusted the straps on my pack, gripping them until my knuckles turned white, and I ran. I bypassed the trail I came in on. If something was waiting for me, it would be on that path. Instead, I cut due west, aiming to intersect with the main logging road a few miles down the ridge. It was rough terrain, deadfall and steep ravines, but I needed to put distance between myself and that cabin. For the first 20 minutes, I moved like a maniac. Branches whipped my face, leaving stinging welts, and I slipped more than once on the slick moss, but I didn't stop. I couldn't shake the feeling of that voice on the recorder. He says I look better when I'm sleeping. Around 3 p.m., I was forced to slow down. The undergrowth was too thick, a tangle of rhododendrons and briars. I was gasping for air, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stopped, leaning against a massive Douglas fir to catch my breath and listen. You know how silence in the woods is supposed to be peaceful? This wasn't peaceful. It was expectant. The birds were gone. The squirrels were gone. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. Then I heard it. Click. It was distinct. The sharp plastic snap of a backpack buckle being fastened. It came from directly behind me, maybe 30 yards back, through the dense fog. I spun around, my hand instinctively going to the hunting knife on my belt. "Who's there?" I yelled. My voice sounded thin, swallowed instantly by the wet trees. "I have a weapon. Back off." Silence. Then from the left, not behind me, but to my left, I heard it again. Click. Then from the right. Click. Click. It wasn't a buckle. It was something mimicking the sound of a buckle. It was too rhythmic, too perfect. It sounded like a recording being played back on a loop. I started backing up, my eyes darting frantically between the trees. I couldn't see anything but the mist and the dark trunks of the firs. "Show yourself!" I screamed, the panic starting to crack my voice. From the mist ahead of me, the direction I was trying to go, a sound drifted back to me. It wasn't a click this time. It was a voice. It was my voice. "Who's there?" it called out. But the tone was wrong. It wasn't angry or scared like I had just been. It was flat, monotone, like someone reading a line from a script they didn't understand. "Who's there?" it repeated, louder this time, closer. I didn't wait to see what was making the sound. I turned and scrambled up the ridge, my legs burning. I wasn't hiking anymore. I was prey, and whatever was out there wasn't just hunting me, it was playing with me. As I crested the ridge, desperate to find the service road, I stumbled into another small clearing. I skidded to a halt, my boots tearing up the earth. I wasn't on the service road. I was back at the cabin. Panic is a cold thing. It doesn't feel like fire, it feels like ice water dunked down your spine. Standing there, staring at that sagging, mold-blackened A-frame for the second time, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. I had walked west. I had checked my compass. I had moved away from the cabin for an hour, pushing through dense brush and climbing a ridge. By all logic, I should have been miles away. But there it was. The same broken porch, the same dark, gaping doorway, the same oppressive silence that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. I checked my compass again. The needle spun lazily, drifting in a slow, meaningless circle. Magnetic anomaly? Maybe, but deep down, I knew it wasn't geology. Okay, I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. Okay, just turn around. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the cabin. I expected something to burst out of that doorway, a bear, a man, something. But nothing moved. The only sound was the rain ticking against the hood of my jacket. I turned and started walking again, this time due north, using the sun, or where the sun should be, as my guide. I moved faster now, less careful about noise. I crashed through ferns that were waist-high, ignoring the thorns tearing at my pants. 10 minutes in, I found the tree. It was a massive hemlock, easily 5 feet across at the base, but it wasn't the size that stopped me. It was what was carved into the bark. Fresh, weeping sap oozed from deep gouges in the wood. Someone, or something, had carved a symbol into the tree at eye level. It wasn't a heart with initials, it wasn't a trail marker. It was a perfect circle, about the size of a dinner plate. Inside the circle was a single deep vertical line. I touched the sap. It was sticky and warm. This had been done minutes ago, while I was walking in circles. I scanned the woods around me. "Is someone out there?" I yelled, trying to sound authoritative, but hearing the tremor in my own voice. Snap. A twig broke to my right. I spun, my hand gripping my knife so hard my knuckles were white. Through the mist in the trees, maybe 50 yards away, I saw movement. It was subtle, just a shadow shifting behind a thick cluster of rhododendrons. It wasn't an animal. It stood upright. "Hey, I see you. Come out." The figure stopped. It didn't run. It didn't hide. It just stood there. Then a voice drifted through the trees. "I see you. Come out." It was my voice again, but this time it wasn't just flat. It was distorted. It sounded like a recording being played at the wrong speed, too slow, the vowels stretching out into a low guttural groan. "I see you." My stomach dropped. This wasn't a parrot. This wasn't a prank. I started backing away again, keeping the knife raised. The figure didn't move. It just stood there in the shadows, perfectly still. But as I watched, something about its silhouette seemed wrong. The proportions were off. The arms looked too long, hanging down past where the knees should be. The head looked too big. And then it took a step forward. It moved with a jerky, unnatural motion like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. One leg swung out wide, the foot planting heavily. Then the other leg dragged forward to meet it. Thump, scrape, thump, scrape. It was coming toward me. I ran. I didn't care about noise anymore. I sprinted, tearing through the undergrowth, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, not running but moving with that same heavy, rhythmic gait, crashing through the brush with terrifying speed. Thump, scrape, thump, scrape. I ran until my lungs burned. I ran until the trees started to blur, and just when I thought my legs would give out, I saw it. Another clearing. Another structure. I almost cried with relief. Maybe it was a ranger station. Maybe it was a road. I burst into the open, my boots sliding in the mud. I looked up. It was the cabin again. I didn't run this time. I physically couldn't. My legs gave out the moment my boots hit the muddy clearing, and I collapsed onto my hands and knees, retching bile into the ferns. The exhaustion wasn't just physical. It was a heavy, psychic weight that pressed down on my skull. It was the realization that geometry didn't matter here. North wasn't north, west wasn't west. All roads led back to the rot. I stayed on the ground for a long time, gasping for air, waiting for the thump-scrape sound to catch up with me. But the woods were silent again. The rain had stopped abruptly, leaving a stillness that felt pressurized, like the air inside a submarine. Eventually, I wiped my mouth and looked at the cabin. Something was different. It was subtle, but after staring at this cursed structure for what felt like an eternity, I noticed it. The front door, which had been hanging open before, was now closed, and the mud around the porch, it was churned up. I forced myself to stand, my knees shaking, and walked closer. The ground around the rotting steps looked like a feedlot. It was a slurry of mud and pine needles, trampled by hundreds of footprints. Not boot prints. Those prints. The long, splayed-toed, heavy-arched bare feet. They went in circles, round and round the cabin, over and over again. And they were fresh. The water was still seeping into the impressions. While I had been running through the woods, frantically trying to escape, it had been here, pacing, waiting, or maybe dancing. I gripped my knife, the handle slick with sweat and rain. I had to go inside. I know how insane that sounds. In a horror movie, you scream at the screen, "Don't go in there!" But out here, with the woods looping back on themselves, the cabin was the only constant. It was the eye of the storm. If there was a way out, or a reason for this, it was inside. I stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned, a low, mournful sound. I reached for the door handle. It was cold, greasy metal. I turned it and pushed. The door swung open with a shriek of rusty hinges. The smell hit me instantly, stronger this time. The metallic copper tang of blood was overpowering, mixed with something sweet, like rotting fruit. I raised my headlamp. The interior had changed. The debris, the old mattress, the beer cans, the trash had been swept to the corners. The floor in the center of the room was clean. The heavy oak table was still there, but the circle of items, the boot, the glasses, the recorder, was gone. Now, the table was set. 2 rusted tin camping plates sat across from each other, 2 dirty mason jars, and in the center, a single flickering candle stuck into a pool of its own wax. I walked toward the table, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I didn't want to look at what was on the plates, but I couldn't look away. On the plate closest to me, there was a pile of gray, fibrous mishmash. It looked like dryer lint mixed with hair. On the other plate, the one opposite me, was a set of car keys. My car keys. I patted my pocket. Empty. I tore my pack off my back and ripped open the top flap where I always kept my spares. Gone. I hadn't felt a thing. I hadn't been touched. Yet somehow, this thing had reached into my pack, taken my keys, and set a place for me at its table. "What do you want?" I whispered. The sound of my own voice felt trespassing in the heavy silence. Then I saw it. Next to the keys, resting on the wood, was a small handheld digital camcorder. The red REC light wasn't on, but the green power light was blinking. I picked it up. The screen folded out. My thumb hovered over the playback button. I knew I shouldn't watch it. I knew it was going to be something that would break whatever fragile grip of sanity I had left. I pressed play. The video was shaky, handheld. It was shot in night vision, that eerie, glowing green tint. It showed a view from high up, looking down, high up in a tree. The camera zoomed in. Below, on the forest floor, A figure was running. He was stumbling, looking back over his shoulder, terrified. He was wearing a red jacket, a gray backpack. It was me. It was footage of me running through the woods 10 minutes ago. The camera panned, following me as I crashed through the brush. And then, from behind the camera, from the person holding it, came a sound. It wasn't a breath. It wasn't a laugh. It was a low, wet voice, right next to the microphone. Run, rabbit, run. Then the camera turned. The operator flipped the lens around to film themselves. I dropped the camcorder. It hit the table, the screen cracking, but the image stayed on. I stared at the frozen frame of the face that had looked into the lens. It was a face, but it wasn't human, and it wasn't a monster. It was a mask made of skin. My skin. I stared at the cracked screen of the camcorder until the battery died and the image faded to black. My brain was trying to reject what I had seen. It wasn't a mask in the traditional sense, no stitching, no blood. It was like wet clay that had been molded into a grotesque approximation of my face. The eyes were dead and flat, like a shark's, but the jawline, the nose, the stubble, it was me. I smashed the camcorder against the table. Plastic shattered, sending shards skittering across the wood. It was a useless, violent gesture, but I needed to break the connection. I grabbed the car keys from the tin plate, my keys, and shoved them into my pocket. I backed out of the cabin, my knife raised. The sun was gone now. The gray twilight of the storm had deepened into a suffocating gloom. The rain had stopped again, leaving the forest dripping and silent. I didn't run this time. Panic had burned itself out, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Running only triggered the loop. If I ran, I ended up back here. The logic of this place was predatory. It fed on fear and flight. I checked my compass, still spinning. I put it away. "I know you're there," I said. My voice was low, steady. I didn't shout. "I'm not playing your game anymore." I walked to the edge of the clearing, choosing a direction at random, straight into the thickest part of the brush where the devil's club was dense. It was slow going. The thorns tore at my clothes and the mud sucked at my boots, but I forced myself to move deliberately. Don't run. Don't look back. For an hour, I trudged through the dark. The silence was absolute. No crickets, no wind, just the wet slap of ferns against my legs and the heavy thud of my own heart. Then the smell hit me again. Not the metallic blood scent from the cabin. This was different. Wood smoke. Hope flared in my chest, bright and dangerous. Smoke meant people, a campfire, maybe a ranger, maybe another hiker who had gotten lost. I moved toward the scent, pushing through a dense thicket of hemlock. The orange glow flickered through the trees ahead, dancing against the wet bark. I crouched low, approaching slowly. If it was it, I needed to know. If it was help, I needed to be careful not to startle them. I reached the edge of a small depression in the earth, peering over a mossy log. There was a fire, crackling merrily in a stone ring. It was small, controlled, a hiker's fire. A tent was pitched to the side, a high-end, ultralight one-man tent. Orange. My breath caught in my throat. I have an orange one-man tent. I looked closer. A backpack was leaned against a log near the fire. Osprey Atmos 65, gray and red. My backpack. And sitting on the log, with its back to me, was a figure. It was wearing a black rain shell and dark hiking pants. My clothes. I looked down at my own body. I was wearing my black rain shell. I was wearing my dark pants. I had my pack on my back. The figure by the fire stretched its arms out to warm its hands. The movement was fluid, human. It reached down, picked up a metal cup, and took a sip. I felt like I was hallucinating. Was I looking at myself? Had I died in the cabin and this was my ghost? Or was I the ghost? Then the figure spoke. It didn't speak to the air. It spoke to me without turning around.
"You're late," it said. The voice was mine, not the distorted, slowed-down mockery from the woods. It was perfect. It had my cadence, my pitch, my exhaustion. I gripped my knife, my hand shaking uncontrollably. "What are you?" The figure stood up slowly. It was exactly my height. It turned around. The firelight illuminated its face. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a blur. It was me. It was a perfect mirror image of my face. But there was one detail that shattered the illusion, one thing that made my knees buckle. The eyes. They weren't human eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and glowing with a faint yellow luminescence like a cat caught in headlights. And the mouth was smiling. But the smile was too wide. It stretched too far, pulling the skin till it looked like it might tear. It took a step toward the log, stepping over the fire without flinching as the flames licked its pants. "I'm the one who gets to leave," it said, the smile widening until I saw rows of needle-sharp, translucent teeth behind my own lips.
Fight or flight is a lie. There is a third option: freeze. It's the brain's way of rebooting when the input data doesn't match reality. Standing across that fire, looking at a creature wearing my face like a cheap Halloween mask, I froze. The thing, the mimic, didn't attack. It didn't lunge. It just stood there, ankle deep in the burning embers of the scattered campfire, smiling that impossible needle-toothed smile. The firelight danced in its yellow eyes, making them look like twin dying suns. "You're afraid," it said. My voice, my inflection. But there was a vibration underneath it, a low-frequency hum that I felt in my molars. "You shouldn't be. It doesn't hurt. It's just shedding." It took a step toward me. That broke the paralysis. I didn't think, I reacted. I wound up and kicked the largest burning log in the fire pit straight at its legs. Sparks exploded in a chaotic shower of orange and red, ash clouding the air between us. Most animals would flinch, a bear would roar, a man would jump back. The mimic didn't blink. The log hit its shins with a wet thud like hitting a bag of sand and rolled away. The creature just kept walking through the shower of sparks, its eyes locked on mine. I turned and bolted. I didn't care about the noise anymore. I didn't care about navigation. I just needed distance. I sprinted into the dark, my arms pumping, my boots tearing up the moss. I aimed downhill, letting gravity do the work, praying I wouldn't snap an ankle on a hidden root. Behind me, I expected the heavy thump scrape of a pursuit. I expected a roar. Instead, I heard whistling. It was a casual, jaunty tune. "Row, row, row your boat." The sound drifted through the trees, perfectly clear, cutting through the heavy mist. It wasn't behind me. It sounded like it was right next to my ear. "Merrily, merrily, merrily, merrily." I covered my ears as I ran, stumbling over a rotting nurse log. "Shut up!" I screamed, the sound tearing out of my throat. "Shut up!" The whistling stopped. Then a whisper directly behind my left shoulder. "Life is but a dream." I spun around, slashing the air with my knife. Nothing. Just the dark, dripping woods and the swirling fog. I kept running, but the terrain was changing. The soft forest floor gave way to jagged rocks and hard-packed dirt. The trees thinned out, replaced by rusted metal skeletons rising from the gloom like tombstones. I had stumbled into the old logging camp. It was a graveyard of industrial machinery, huge rusted donkey engines, crane arms, and cables thick as pythons, all left to rot when the logging company went bust 50 years ago. The metal was slick with rain and algae, looming out of the fog in twisted, angular shapes. I scrambled over a pile of rusted chains, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. I needed high ground. If I could get up high, maybe I could see where I was. Maybe I could defend myself. I saw a massive, rusted crane, a yarder, sitting on a concrete pad. The operator's cab was 20 feet up, accessible by a metal ladder welded to the side.
I sheathed my knife and grabbed the first rung. The cold steel bit into my palms. I climbed, my boots slipping on the wet metal, ignoring the tetanus-laced rust flaking off under my grip. I reached the cab, hauled myself inside, and slammed the heavy iron door shut. It didn't have a lock, so I jammed my boot against it. The windows were gone, shattered decades ago, but the metal walls felt like armor. I collapsed onto the rusty floor, chest heaving. I was safe. For a second, I was safe. I listened. Silence. No whistling, no footsteps. Just the drip, drip, drip of rain on the metal roof. I crawled to the empty window frame and peered out. The fog swirled around the base of the crane, obscuring the ground. I couldn't see anything. Then the crane shuddered. It was a slight vibration at first, humming through the metal floor. Then a rhythmic clang, clang, clang. Someone was climbing the ladder. I scrambled back from the window, grabbing my knife again. "Get back!" I yelled. "I'll kill you!" The climbing stopped. For a long, agonizing minute, there was silence. Then a hand reached up and gripped the bottom of the window frame. It wasn't the mimic's hand. It wasn't pale or distorted. It was a gloved hand, a thick leather work glove, stained with grease. A head popped up into the window frame. It was an old man. He had a gray beard, a dirty trucker hat, and eyes wide with terror. He looked at me, then looked down at the ground, then back at me. "Help me," he rasped, his voice sounding like sandpaper. "Please, it's right behind me." I lowered the knife, confusion washing over me. "Who are you?" "I'm the watchman," he wheezed, pulling himself halfway into the cab. "I've been hiding in the boiler, but it found me. We have to go, now." I stepped forward to help him. I reached out my hand. He grabbed my wrist. His grip was impossibly strong, like a vice. I looked at his hand again. The glove. It wasn't a glove. The texture of the leather blended seamlessly into his wrist. There was no seam, no cuff. The glove was his skin. I looked up at his face. The terror was gone. The gray beard shifted, the hair retracting into the skin like worms burrowing into mud. The face smoothed out. The trucker hat melted, dissolving into dark, wet hair. The face shifted, molding like clay. The jaw widened, the nose sharpened. In seconds, the old man was gone. I was looking at myself again. "Gotcha," it whispered.
The grip on my wrist didn't feel like a hand. It felt like a hydraulic clamp wrapped in warm, wet leather. I stared into my own eyes, or rather, the yellow, flat approximations of them, and saw zero recognition. There was no humanity, no soul, just a biological curiosity, like a child inspecting a bug before pulling its wings off. "Gotcha," it whispered again, the words sliding out with a wet slur. Adrenaline is a hell of a drug. It overrides logic, pain, and hesitation. In that split second, I didn't see me. I saw a predator. I still had my knife in my left hand. I didn't think about the morality of stabbing a face that looked like mine. I didn't think about the physics of it. I drove the blade down, hard, into the forearm that was gripping me. It should have crunched against bone. It should have spurted red, arterial blood. It should have caused the thing to scream. Instead, the knife sank in with a sickening squelch, like stabbing a bucket of thick grease. The mimic didn't scream. It didn't even flinch. It just looked at the knife buried in its arm, then back at me, tilting its head in a bird-like inquisitive motion. Black, viscous fluid, smelling of tar and old batteries, oozed around the blade. But the grip loosened, just for a fraction of a second. I yanked my arm back with everything I had. My wrist popped, a sharp bolt of pain shooting up to my shoulder, but I was free. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I slammed my boot into its chest. The thing was heavy, unnaturally so, but it was balanced precariously on the ladder. It tipped backward, its eyes went wide, the yellow glow flaring, and its mouth opened in a silent circle of surprise. It fell. I watched it tumble 20 feet down, hitting the rusted metal of the crane's base with a bone-shattering clang, then bouncing off into the mud below. It landed in a heap of tangled limbs, looking like a broken marionette. I gasped for air, clutching my throbbing wrist. It's dead. It has to be dead.
I leaned out the window, peering into the gloom. The heap of limbs began to twitch. First, a leg snapped back into place with a sound like a gunshot, then an arm twisting around with a wet grinding noise until the elbow locked. The head, which had been twisted almost backward, ratcheted around to face up at me. It smiled. The teeth were gone now, replaced by a smooth, dark slit. It began to climb the ladder again, faster this time. Thump scrape, thump scrape. I scrambled to the other side of the cab. There was no door, just a rusted metal wall. I was trapped. No, wait. The front windshield was gone. Below it, the crane's boom arm extended out over the yard, a rusted steel girder suspended above a maze of old machinery. It was a 20-foot drop to a pile of logs, but the arm itself sloped down towards a pile of sawdust. I didn't hesitate. I vaulted through the empty windshield frame and onto the slick, wet metal of the boom arm. I slid more than ran, my boots scrabbling for purchase on the algae-slick steel. Behind me, I heard the mimic scramble into the cab. It let out a sound that I will never forget, not a roar, but a high-pitched oscillating frequency, like a radio tuning between stations. I reached the end of the boom and jumped. I hit the sawdust pile hard, rolling to absorb the impact. The wood chips were soaked and heavy, smelling of rot, but they cushioned the fall. I scrambled to my feet, my ankle screaming in protest, and ran. I was in the thick of the iron graveyard now. Massive rusted hulks of machinery loomed on all sides. Donkey engines, skidders, debarkers. It was a labyrinth of metal and shadow. I wove between them, trying to break my line of sight, but the sound followed me. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was voices. "Help me," the old watchman's raspy wheeze. "Wait up, guys," a young woman's voice, cheerful. "Mommy?" a child, terrifyingly small and scared. "Run, rabbit, run," my own voice. They were all coming from one throat, a chorus of the dead overlapping and distorting, echoing off the wet metal around me. It was trying to confuse me, to make me turn to a voice I might trust. I covered my ears, stumbling forward. Don't listen, don't listen. I rounded a corner, past a massive yellow bulldozer that was half sunk in the mud, and saw it. A light. Not a fire, not a flashlight, an electric light. About 200 yards ahead, through the mist, a single, steady halogen bulb was burning above a corrugated metal shed. It looked industrial, modern. A generator hummed faintly in the distance. Civilization. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning. The voices behind me were getting closer. The thump scrape had changed to a rapid, heavy gallop. It was on all fours now. I could hear the wet slap of its hands and feet hitting the mud, closing the distance. I reached the shed. There was a heavy steel door with a keypad. I slammed my fist against it. "Help me! Open up!" I grabbed the handle. Locked. I looked back. The mimic burst out from behind the bulldozer. It was still wearing my clothes, but they were shredded. Its body had elongated, the limbs stretching like taffy. It was galloping on hands and feet, its head lolling loosely on a neck that was too long. It saw me. It stopped. It stood up slowly, rising to a height of nearly 7 feet. It smoothed down its shredded shirt. It fixed its hair. It walked towards me, calm, composed, raising a hand as if to wave. "Hey there, son. Open the door. It's cold out here."
Hearing my father's voice was worse than the chase. It wasn't the voice of the man who died of cancer in a sterile hospital room 3 years ago. It was the voice of the man who taught me to fish, strong and warm, smelling of old spice and sawdust. "Open the door, son. I've got the truck running. We can go home." The mimic stood 10 feet away. The halogen light above the shed flickered, casting jerky strobe-light shadows across its face. It was smiling that stretched, skin-tearing smile, but its eyes were weeping black fluid. I jammed my hand into my pocket, my fingers scraping against the metal of the keys I had taken from the plate in the cabin. It was a desperate, illogical Hail Mary. Why would car keys open a heavy steel industrial door? But as I pulled them out, I saw it. On the ring, next to the fob for my truck, was a small, rusted brass key. It wasn't mine. I hadn't noticed it in the dim light of the cabin. The mimic took another step. Its limbs rippled, bones audible shifting under the skin to accommodate the movement. "Don't you want to go home?"
it asked, the voice cracking, sliding into a high-pitched feminine giggle at the end. I shoved the brass key into the lock on the heavy handle. It stuck. "Come on," I hissed, twisting it with both hands. The mimic lunged. It didn't run. It exploded forward, covering the 10 feet in a blur of motion. I felt the wind of its movement, smelled the overwhelming stench of rot and ozone. The key turned. I threw my weight against the door. It swung inward with a heavy, pressurized hiss. I fell inside, scrambling on the concrete floor, and kicked the door shut just as a pale, elongated hand slapped against the metal frame. Clang! The latch engaged. I scrambled backward into the dark, hyperventilating, waiting for the door to buckle. Bang! 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 3 heavy, rhythmic hits, then silence. I fumbled for my headlamp, my hands shaking so badly I dropped it twice. When I finally got it on, the beam cut through the dusty air. I wasn't in a maintenance shed, or at least, not anymore. The space was massive, filled with rows of metal shelving, but there were no tools, no spare parts. The shelves were lined with backpacks, dozens of them, Kelty, Osprey, North Face. Some were faded and covered in decades of dust. Others looked brand new, the bright nylon still vibrant. They were arranged by color: blue, red, green. I walked down the aisle, the beam of my light shaking. On the floor, beneath the shelves, were boots, hundreds of pairs, hiking boots, running shoes, rain boots, all arranged in perfect concentric circles. This wasn't a shed. It was a pantry. I reached out and touched a blue backpack near the front. It had a luggage tag: Sarah Jenkins, Seattle, WA. I shone the light further back. There was a desk in the corner, an old metal tanker desk from the 70s. It was covered in papers. I walked over to it. The papers weren't logs or manifests. They were maps, topographical maps of Blackwood Ridge, hand-drawn on napkins, backs of receipts, and torn pages of journals. They were covered in frantic scribbles. "It hates the light. Don't run. It likes when you run. It sounds like Mom." And in the center of the desk, sitting on a pristine white plate, was a driver's license. My driver's license. I patted my pocket. My wallet was still there. I pulled it out. My license was in the plastic window. I looked back at the desk. The license on the plate. The photo wasn't me. It was the mimic. It was a photo of that thing, wearing my face, smiling that impossible smile. The air in the room suddenly felt very cold. I heard a sound, not from outside the door, from inside the room. Drip. I froze. I slowly swept my headlamp up. Above the desk, in the rafters of the high metal ceiling, something was hanging. It was wrapped in what looked like spider silk, but thicker, wet, and glistening. A cocoon. As the light hit it, the cocoon shifted. A hand, a human hand, pale and lifeless, flopped out of the webbing. Then another drip hit the desk, and then a voice came from the cocoon. It was muffled, weak but unmistakable. "Help me." It wasn't a recording. It wasn't a mimicry. It was a person. I stepped closer, horrified. "Who's there?" The voice from the cocoon answered. "I'm you." The webbing tore open. A face looked down at me. It was me. Not a mask, not a copy. It was me, unshaven, terrified, eyes bloodshot, the real me. And as I stared up at myself hanging in the rafters, a cold realization washed over me, heavier than the fear. I looked down at my own hands holding the flashlight. They were pale, smooth. The skin on my wrist. There was a seam. The voice from the rafters screamed, "It's wearing me! Oh God, it's wearing me!"
I clawed at my wrist. The logic of the situation had fractured. I stood in that cold, silent pantry of lost souls, staring at a seam in my own flesh, while a version of me, a version that looked broken, wet, and terrified, hung from the rafters like a side of beef. "It's tight, isn't it?" the thing in the webbing wheezed. Its voice was a wet gurgle, bubbling through fluids. The skin.
It always feels too tight at first. I dug my fingernails into the seam on my wrist. I scratched frantically, tearing at the line where the glove met the arm. I needed to see what was underneath. I needed to see the black tar. I needed to know if I was the monster. My nails broke the skin, but there was no black ooze, no smooth gray clay. There was blood, bright, hot, red arterial blood. It welled up, dripping onto the concrete floor. The pain was sharp and blindingly real. I stared at the blood. The seam. The seam was gone. It had been a trick of the light, a hallucination, or maybe a projection. I looked up at the rafters. The thing in the cocoon stopped wheezing. The face, my face, hanging in the dark began to change, the jaw unhinged, dropping unnaturally low. The eyes, which had been pleading a second ago, rolled back to reveal those twin, flat yellow discs. "Disappointing," it said. The voice wasn't mine anymore. It was the chorus again, the overlap of a dozen stolen voices. "You didn't break." The webbing exploded. The creature didn't drop like a man. It poured out of the cocoon like a liquid solidifying in midair. It landed on the metal desk with a heavy, wet impact that crumpled the steel. It wasn't wearing a disguise anymore. It was raw. It looked like a human nervous system stripped of skin, red muscle, white sinew, and glistening bone, but the proportions were all wrong. The fingers were too long, ending in bone spurs. The rib cage was expanded, massive, housing lungs that could mimic any sound on Earth. And the face was a blank, shifting slate of muscle, constantly twitching as if trying to decide who to be. It lunged. I threw the heavy metal chair at it. The creature backhanded it out of the air without slowing down, the chair clattering into the darkness of the warehouse. I turned and ran. I sprinted down the aisle of backpacks, my boots slipping on the concrete. I could hear it behind me, a wet, slapping sound like wet towels hitting a wall, moving impossibly fast. Slap thud, slap thud. I reached the end of the aisle. Dead end. Just a wall of corrugated metal and shelves of hiking boots. I spun around. The creature was at the other end of the aisle, 30 feet away. It stopped. It rose up on its hind legs, sniffing the air. It knew I was trapped. "Where are you going, Daniel?" it asked. It used my real name. I hadn't spoken my name out loud. My driver's license was on the desk, but it hadn't looked at it. It just knew. It started walking toward me, slowly this time. It dragged its long, clawed fingers along the metal shelves, creating a screeching sound that set my teeth on edge. Sparks flew. I looked frantically around. To my right, high up on the wall, was an industrial ventilation fan. It was massive, crying out with rust, but the housing was big enough for a man to crawl through. Below it, a stack of wooden pallets. I didn't think. I scrambled up the pallets, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature roared, a sound that shook the dust from the ceiling, and charged. I leaped for the fan housing, my fingers hooked onto the rusty grate. I pulled, screaming with effort. The grate groaned, the bolts rusted through, and it gave way. I swung myself up into the dark, greasy tunnel of the vent, just as the creature slammed into the wall below. The metal of the shed buckled. Claws raked against the opening, missing my boot by an inch. I crawled. The vent was tight, smelling of old grease and dead animals. I scrambled on my elbows and knees, the sharp metal cutting into my clothes. Behind me, I heard the creature tearing the wall apart, ripping the corrugated steel like paper. I saw light ahead. Gray, dim light. I kicked out the external grate and tumbled out onto wet earth. I was outside, but I wasn't at the trailhead. I wasn't near my truck. I was at the edge of the world. The vent had dumped me out onto a rocky outcropping. Below me, a sheer drop into a ravine filled with fog. To my left and right, dense, impenetrable forest. And directly ahead, a narrow, rocky trail led up to a singular point, a jagged spire of rock jutting out over the valley. The pulpit. The scenic overlook I had been trying to reach all day. There was nowhere else to go. The shed was behind me, and the creature was already inside the vent, its heavy breathing echoing through the metal tube. I scrambled up the trail toward the overlook. The rain had started again, freezing and hard. It lashed against my face, washing away the blood from my wrist. I reached the end of the pulpit. It was a cul-de-sac of granite, surrounded by a 1,000-foot drop on 3 sides. I turned around to face the trail. I pulled my knife. It looked pathetic in the gray light, a 3-inch blade against a nightmare. The sound of tearing metal stopped. Then, from the darkness of the vent opening 50 yards away, a figure emerged. It wasn't the raw, skinless monster anymore. It had put its suit back on. It walked out into the rain wearing my face, my clothes, and my pack. It looked tired. It looked scared. It looked exactly like me. It walked toward me on the narrow trail, raising its hands in a placating gesture. "Daniel!" shouted, its voice cracking with relief. "Oh, thank God. I thought I lost you. Put the knife down. It's me. It's really me." It was the perfect performance yet. If I hadn't just seen it shed its skin, I would have believed it. It took a step closer, the rain matting its hair down. "We can go now," it said, smiling warmly. I found the way out. I backed up until my heels were on the edge of the cliff. Pebbles skittered off the side, falling silently into the void. There was nowhere else to run.
"Daniel," it said again, softer this time. "Please, you're hallucinating. The hypothermia, it does things to your head. Just take my hand." It stood 5 feet away, offering a hand that was identical to mine. Same calluses, same scar on the thumb from a table saw accident 3 years ago. It was shivering, hunched against the wind, mimicking the exact physiological response to the freezing rain. For a second, just a split second, I wanted to believe it. My brain, screaming for survival, wanted to believe that the last 4 hours had been a psychotic break, that I was just sick, cold, and lost. But then it blinked. It wasn't a normal blink. The eyelids didn't close vertically. A nictitating membrane, a translucent, milky inner eyelid, slid horizontally across the pupil and back. It saw me staring. The warm, concerned expression on its face didn't vanish. It simply turned off. The fear left its eyes. The shivering stopped instantly. It straightened its posture, standing tall and unbothered by the gale-force wind. "Pity," it said. The voice wasn't mine anymore. It was a flat, buzzing drone, like a hive of wasps speaking through a synthesizer. I really liked this one. It fit so well. It smiled. Not the human smile, the other one. The jaw unhinged with a wet crack, the skin around the cheeks tearing audibly as the mouth widened beyond the ears. Rows of needle teeth, translucent and dripping with saliva, pushed forward through the gums. It lunged. It covered the 5 feet in a blur of motion, hands transforming into those pale, elongated claws midair. I didn't fight. I didn't try to stab it. I did the only thing it didn't expect. I turned around and stepped into the void. The fall wasn't like the movies. There was no slow-motion realization. It was just a sudden, violent removal of the world beneath my feet. The wind roared in my ears, stripping the breath from my lungs. I fell for maybe 3 seconds, tumbling through the gray mist. Then I hit the canopy. The impact was brutal. Branches whipped and snapped against my body, tearing at my clothes and skin. I bounced off a massive fir limb, spinning uncontrollably before slamming into another. The world became a kaleidoscope of pain and green blur. I hit the ground hard. I don't remember landing. I just remember the sound, a wet crunch that vibrated through my entire skeleton. Then blackness. I woke up to the sound of beeping. It was rhythmic, annoying, and persistent. I tried to move my arm to shut it off, but my body refused to listen. I was heavy, encased in something stiff. I opened my eyes. White ceiling, fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic and floor wax. "He's awake," a voice called out, a nurse. The next few hours were a blur of doctors, policemen, and questions I couldn't answer. What happened? How did you get down there? Who was with you? They told me a search and rescue helicopter had spotted my thermal signature in a ravine 3 days after I went missing.
I had 2 broken legs, 3 cracked ribs, a punctured lung, and severe hypothermia. They said it was a miracle I was alive. I told them about the bear. That's the lie I came up with. I told them a bear chased me, I got lost, I fell. It was simple. It was believable. Because if I told them the truth about the cabin, the recordings, the thing that wore my face, they would lock me in a padded room for the rest of my life. I spent 6 weeks in the hospital. My legs healed, the ribs knit back together. Physically, I was fine. But the police, they had questions about my truck. "We never found your vehicle at the trailhead," the officer told me one afternoon. "We assumed you parked somewhere else, or maybe it was stolen." "Stolen," I said quickly. "Yeah, stolen." I knew it wasn't stolen, not in the traditional sense. I was discharged a week later. My sister came to pick me up. She drove me back to my apartment in Seattle. It felt strange to be back in the city. The noise, the people, the safety. I limped into my apartment, throwing my bag on the couch. I went straight to the bathroom to splash water on my face. I gripped the porcelain sink, staring into the mirror. I looked older. There were new scars on my forehead from the branches. My eyes looked tired, hollow. But it was me. It was definitely me. I turned the faucet off and reached for a towel. Then, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a notification from my bank, a credit card alert. Transaction approved, $45, gas station, Forks, WA. My blood ran cold. My wallet had been in my pocket when I fell. The cards were canceled. This was my backup card, the one I kept in the glove box of my truck. I unlocked my phone, my fingers trembling. I opened my cloud photo storage. There was a new upload, time-stamped 10 minutes ago. It was a selfie. The angle was low, taken from the driver's seat of my truck. The background showed the passing blur of a highway, rain streaking the windshield. The face in the picture was smiling, a wide, toothy, impossible smile that stretched just a little too far toward the ears. The eyes were hidden by sunglasses, but the skin looked perfect, smooth, new. It was wearing my favorite flannel. The caption under the photo, auto-generated by the voice-to-text feature, read simply, "Heading home. See you soon." I dropped the phone. I'm typing this from a motel room 3 states away. I don't know where I'm going. I just know I can't be Daniel anymore, because someone else is doing a much better job of it than I ever could. And he's coming to finish the job.